Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Scope 3 supply chain emissions, in which we have a particular focus on obtaining better quality primary data from our suppliers. I'm Giles Scott Hayward, and I manage the Greenstone Sustainable Supply Chain Solution supplier portal, which enables clients to align their purchasing and supplier management practices with their sustainability goals. This is an informative webinar only, so as such, we'll try and keep it to about 30 minutes with no Q&A. However, if you do have any questions at all, then please do record them in the question box facility provided. So hopefully you can see that in your control panel. We'll respond to all those questions and distribute a Q&A document to all attendees if appropriate. So today, we'll have a brief look at Scope 3 emissions more widely, why Scope 3 supply chain emissions are of particular importance, and what challenges are involved in addressing these emissions. We'll then look at a client case study and the steps being taken to move from high-level supply chain GHG estimation towards better quality primary data. So quickly, for those unfamiliar with Greenstone, we've been operating since 2007 and provide sustainability software solutions, and that's with uncapped support to users in over 100 countries. We're aligned with over 30 international frameworks, and Greenstone and our solutions, our SaaS solutions, are SOC 2 certified. We have software solutions, so we have 3 software solutions, and we'll look at these more closely and at how they enable the Scope 3 emissions calculation and reporting through the integration of them all. The enterprise module has 3 modules. Enterprise solution, has 3 modules. It's the environment module for calculating and tracking your GHG footprint, frameworks module for aligning, managing and reporting ESG metrics in accordance with global frameworks and custom metrics, health and safety for instant reporting across businesses and tracking and consolidating H&S data. Supplier portal, which enables clients to engage directly with their suppliers on standard Greenstone or bespoke assessments. An investor portal for tracking ESG performance across your portfolios. So all of these provide carbon calculation and utilize our emissions factor library. And from a Scope 3 standpoint, all the solutions are integrated to calculate, share and report against all 15 Scope 3 categories. So I thought it'd be interesting to start with a quick poll in order to understand a little bit more about everyone's experiences to date and perhaps a maturity in relation to supplier emissions. So the question hopefully has come up for you there. Are you currently tracking and reporting Scope 3 supply chain emissions? So just give that a few seconds and hopefully I'll be able to see the responses as well. Perfect. Okay, so that's closed now. So what have we got? We've got 35% currently reporting supply chain emissions, 43 just looking at it, and 21 we don't report supply chain emissions but plan to. Okay, well, firstly, interesting to note that only 1% of people have said that they're not material to the business, which is probably a reflection of the topic of the webinar, but also 35% are currently engaged on this and reporting on supply chain emissions. So it'd be interesting to understand maybe at a later date what that reporting involves, but also the majority of you are just starting to look at this area. So hopefully, I think that's commensurate with what we'd expect. And so hopefully we can inform all of those kind of positions throughout the webinar. Okay, so what are Scope 3 emissions? I won't take too long on this, but if you'd like some further detail, then we recently provided a webinar dedicated to this topic, so you can access that on our website, and we'll have a look at some additional resources at the end as well. Scope 3 emissions, also known as value chain emissions, are indirect greenhouse gas emissions, both upstream and downstream, of an organization's main operations. So this usually translates as all of the emissions a company is responsible for outside of its own operations, from the goods and services to the disposal of the products it sells. To date, organizations have typically focused on monitoring and documenting scope 1 and 2 emissions, since they are relatively easy to interpret and the data is readily accessible. Due to the large number of organizations involved and the complex kind of logistical obligations of course, product use and disposal, it's often the case that scope 3 emissions are by far the largest proportion of an organization's carbon footprint. Yet they're also the area over which businesses have the least control and have the most difficulty in quantifying. So under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance, scope 3 emissions are split into 15 categories, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is done to help businesses identify which activities are relevant to them, break down how they might more easily collect that data, and inform the reporting and management of calculated emissions. So when looking at supplier emissions, the majority of the emissions fall into category 1, which is purchased goods and services. And this is because this includes emissions from all goods and services not otherwise included in the other categories of upstream scope 3 emissions. That's not to say, however, that some sources of supplier emissions and some entire suppliers' emissions would be allocated to other upstream categories, so 2 to 8. For example, transportation of purchased goods from a direct supplier to the reporting company in unowned vehicles would be accounted for in category 4, upstream transportation and distribution. There are numerous reasons beyond the urgent need for rapid decarbonisation, global decarbonisation, I should say, that are driving organisations towards more accurate scope 3 emissions disclosure. 3 of the key drivers are international frameworks such as CDP, science-based targets, and net zero pathways. And in turn, these drivers are accentuated by investor pressure for ESG disclosure. Again, Greenstone has provided a webinar specifically dedicated to science-based targets and net zero targets. So yeah, if you want more details on those, then please head to the website. Suffice to say that both these place a requirement on not only understanding your supplier emissions, but being in a position to apply different emission reduction levers to meet long-term targets. International frameworks are also driving more focus and transparency on scope 3 emissions. In 2021, CDP further amended its climate change questionnaire to include 2 questions centered on the intention to publish a low carbon transition plan. Disclosing a plan like this encourages investors and other stakeholders to evaluate whether a company is adapting its business model for success in a net zero economy. And this is something that can't be complete without a robust approach to understanding and reporting scope 3 emissions. CDP has also modified existing questions relating to science-based targets and net zero targets, which in themselves are key drivers that we touched on, with companies scoring more highly for setting these targets. And this is in addition to existing the CDP requirement to disclose companies' scope 3 emissions and to demonstrate an appropriate approach to assessing material scope 3 categories. Similarly to GRI, to highlight just one additional framework, also has specific disclosure categories relating to scope 3 emissions. But why are supplier emissions of particular importance compared to other potential scope 3 emission sources? So we'll have a little look at that. Firstly, it's been calculated that 8 supply chains account for more than 50% of global emissions, with, for example, food representing a quarter of global emissions. So if this is the case, then the importance of tackling supplier emissions is both vital in meeting the global carbon budget, as well as being core, trickling down and being core to individual organizations being able to meet their own targets, for example, science-based targets. And we can see here from this chart that The other supply chains are identified as construction, fashion, FMCG, electronics, automotive, professional services, and other freight. Secondly, the emissions in supply chains generally exceed an organization's direct emissions. So not only does this mean that potentially huge volumes of total global emissions are being ignored, it means that in those sectors where a company's direct emissions footprint is relatively low, companies can significantly reduce larger volumes of emissions in their supply chain than they could through their direct operations. So in here we can see that in 8 out of 12 sectors, Scope 3 supply chain emissions account for more than 50% of total emissions. And in construction, auto, food and FMCG, this figure is actually over 80%. So quite a big disparity between direct and indirect there. This story is further corroborated by CDP's Global Supply Chain Report, which states that based on disclosure anyway, Scope 3 supply chain emissions are on average 11.4% higher than operational emissions. And that's a figure that's increased from an average of 5.5% in their 2019 report. Another key point to make is that because many supply chains are geographically dispersed, Scope 3 actions can have a really big impact in countries where regulatory pressure is low. And this is because supply chains are global. Many organizations engage with complex international supply bases, and this results in an opportunity to drive emission reductions in countries with high carbon intensity but limited policy support. Which leads us to another key element in supply chain emission reduction, which is the role played by the suppliers themselves in your journey. This is an opportunity not only for exponential impact on global emission reductions, but also for achieving closer and longer term supplier relationships, circular approaches to your business and that business with suppliers, collaboration on product design, whilst at the same time reducing procurement risk as well as climate risk. Lastly, CDP estimated that 40% of global emissions are driven or influenced by companies through their purchases and products. So it's pretty clear that supplier emissions or upstream Scope 3 emissions are a vital component in keeping within the global carbon budget, and also key for companies from an ESG disclosure perspective. But what challenges do we need to overcome to understand supplier emissions, let alone reduce them? So our second and final poll question then, it'd be great to understand or to get an understanding of what you feel is the biggest challenge to calculating and reducing supplier emissions. So the question is, what is your biggest challenge in calculating and reducing Scope 3 supply chain emissions? Great, so that's closed now. So a large majority, I know we're kind of limited in the options there, and I did originally put down many more, but there's a limit in the software, and so that's what we have. But I think it's interesting to note obtaining reliable, auditable primary supplier data as by far and away the winner there, which is great because we're going to look at that in due course very shortly actually, and hopefully we can provide some insight into how we address that at Greenstone. So obviously there are extensive challenges, but what we've listed here covers much of what is a daunting prospect for a lot of organizations. I feel it's worth highlighting the particular challenges of primary data collection, which we touched on in that poll, but also selecting of emission factors, supplier engagement, the multiple calculation methods available, tracking against targets, and selecting scope boundaries. These are all items that we're trying to address through the solutions at the moment, and hopefully we can show you how we do that. But ultimately, it's very difficult to simply move from a high level of estimation to a more engaged supply chain, which then provides more accurate data and can be useful, which can then be usefully used to inform emissions reduction targets. It's necessary to do so, though, as for the reasons that we've discussed. Organizations need greater accuracy and transparency across their supply chain emissions, and without this, the only emission reduction lever open to them is to become more efficient as a business and to spend less. The other levers that are available, so selecting products and suppliers based on carbon performance and reducing the supplier emissions themselves, all require calculation of carbon emissions in order to inform the decision-making process and ultimately the gathering of some primary data as well. So with these challenges in mind, it should be useful to have a look at a client case study to see how an organization can move from that high level of estimation to a position where they have multiple reduction levers in play. So we'll look at a financial services organization that, as we have discussed and looked at in those charts, sits in a sector where the upstream scope 3 emissions probably far outweigh that of their direct emissions. So they have over 5,000 suppliers in total, of which 75 are designated by procurement as key suppliers, and that's based on kind of core services and spend thresholds. The company is mature in its reporting of scope 1 and 2 emissions and their scope 3 business travel. So fairly typical from many of our clients. They've not yet addressed supplier emissions, but have set net zero target and are publicly committed to setting a science-based target. So step one in the process is to get some understanding of the greenhouse gas or GHG emissions profile across the full supplier database, so if possible. This can be carried out using the most basic spend-based assessment process, so using the economic value of goods and services purchased. And in this case, it was achievable due to kind of accurate procurement data kept by the client, which ensured the spend data was clearly tracked and the active supplier lists clearly accessible. So using the estimated emissions output from this assessment, you're then in a better position to identify which supplier categories and which suppliers represent the largest proportion of emissions and which are potentially easier opportunities for emission reduction. So the aim is to both inform the supplier engagement program in step 2 in order to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of the engagement work you do with suppliers. Step 2 is then enabled through our supplier portal solution, and this can form part of a wider responsible sourcing program, so in which the full supplier population is engaged, and that could be, for example, on supplier codes of conduct, attestations, and much wider subject matter areas. So the aim of step 2 is to engage relevant suppliers on the topic of GHG data and carbon reduction and to identify what type of scope 3 data is available from them. So, for example, are suppliers able to provide you with raw consumption data or already calculated emissions? Is this data directly related to the services or products that they provide to your own organization? Can the emissions related to your purchases be isolated to a particular facility or site? Alternatively, will the supplier only be able to provide data to calculate a total annual corporate emissions figure, which would then need to be allocated accordingly? Or perhaps the supplier is not in a position to provide any data to directly inform emissions calculation. These types of data-driven questions can also be distributed alongside other GHG maturity-based questions. So, for example, about emissions disclosure, environmental policies, and reduction targets for energy, waste, water, travel, and so on. So all of this builds up a picture of the type of supplier you're engaging with and should inform the potential approach that will need to be taken to improve the data collection process. So in this example, the suppliers targeted for detailed engagement included approximately about 60 out of the 75 key suppliers, and those discarded were generally a result of being difficult to engage with or representing only a small chance of early emission reduction. For example, large multinational IT suppliers are often unlikely to disclose directly to customers, and so maybe publicly available emissions data needs to be used instead. However, key suppliers often represent a heightened potential for collaboration, emission reductions, and mutual benefits from a closer, longer-term strategic relationship, and that's potentially due to the relationship that already exists. The additional suppliers identified for engagement on GHG data were from high-emitting supplier categories, and took the total to well over 100 suppliers engaged specifically on maturity around GHG data. So the aim of the emissions screening is to inform the supplier engagement process. The supplier engagement process, in turn, is designed to inform the data capture and calculation process. So the GHG protocol outlines multiple calculation methods. In general, more specific methods yield higher quality Scope 3 emissions data, whereas less specific methods yield lower quality Scope 3 emissions data. It doesn't always work that way, but typically it does. So these methods are supplier specific, which collects product level cradle to gate GHG inventory data; hybrid method, which uses a combination of supplier specific activity data. So when we look at that poll, that's still primary data, and secondary data to fill the gaps. And this method, the hybrid method, involves collecting allocated Scope 1 and 2 emissions data, calculating upstream emissions of goods and services, and then using secondary data where required to calculate upstream emissions. So still a large emphasis on direct supplier engagement there. The average data and spend data methods both estimate emissions for goods and services by collecting data on the amount or economic value of the goods or services purchased. So as part of this process, it's key to identify what calculation method will then be utilized. And this is naturally going to be heavily influenced by the quality and completeness of the data that hopefully you've identified as being available from the suppliers. So companies should select calculation methods for supplier activity based on various criteria, such as the relative size of the emissions from supplier activity, and we have an indication of this from the GHG screening in step 1, data availability, data quality, and the cost and effort required to apply each method. So through our supplier engagement effort that we've just run using Supplier Portal, these decisions on availability, quality, cost, and effort are now far better informed. So the supplier engagement program that we've run then directly feeds into the decision-making tree outlined by the GHG protocol. So we've shown that here for determining the appropriate calculation method. And I've just overlaid, very simply, the first 3 steps of the client case study, from profiling the supply chain GHG emissions to engaging suppliers on the availability and state of data, to the targeted capturing of appropriate data to inform the best calculation methods. So this brings us to, excuse me, this brings us to step 3. So once you've received the GHG assessment, data assessment responses from suppliers, it should be possible to identify the type of data you need to collect from each supplier, and therefore which subsequent method to select to calculate the emissions from those suppliers. So is it going to be through primary data, full estimation using secondary data, or a mixture of the two? The data collection and calculation is then carried out through Supplier Portal, so through the distribution of our flexible carbon calculation wizards and automatic location-based emissions calculations. These enable the clients to capture either pre-calculated emissions data from suppliers or to automatically calculate supplier emissions based on the activity data provided. So these wizards can be used to capture data at different levels. So that could be, as we touched on earlier, an annual supplier corporate footprint, which can then be allocated based on either spend or product information, or to calculate emissions that align with your own specific reporting periods and relate directly to the services or goods you're purchasing. Or indeed, they could relate to specific sites or business units. So then the final two steps. Step 4, I guess, has been the aim throughout this process, the goal, and that's to be able to amalgamate the supplier emissions data that has been captured, calculated, and estimated, and assign all the relevant data sources, so sources of that emissions data, to the appropriate 15 Scope 3 categories. So this means that the Scope 3 supplier emissions can then be included in your organization's full scope emissions reporting, and those supplier emissions can feed into and be tracked against those long-term targets that we discussed at the start, so science-based targets and net zero targets. And we do this through at Greenstone through the integration between Supplier Portal and our enterprise environment module. So with GHG emissions data that's been calculated, it's automatically shared between the two systems, hopefully for kind of complete end-to-end Scope 3 supplier emissions solution. So naturally, the quality and scope of the activity and emissions data that you receive from suppliers should evolve and hopefully improve over time. When we looked at the case study, I mean, it's obvious to note that we're starting with a small proportion of that 5,000 suppliers, and that may well increase over time in both scope, so volume, as well as quality of the data. But it's vital not to neglect your suppliers. So from step 2, the supplier GHG engagement piece, there will have been a number of suppliers where you identified, what calculation wizards you need to send them to inform that. But there'll be a number of suppliers that were identified as poorly equipped to deal with the requests for emissions data. And there needs to be a significant investment in those suppliers in terms of education to help them in a changing marketplace. So that helps the supplier, but it will also improve the granularity and accuracy of your own reporting. So lastly, just a quick look at how software is being used to accurately kind of improve the Scope 3 supply chain emissions. I hope that the example that we've run through there has given you an idea of the process and some ideas on how you might start to tackle it. But just to readdress how we're doing it through the solutions at Greenstone, and we've touched on it already, but we have an ecosystem of these sustainability tools which are integrated to provide the best possible coverage of all emission scopes. So all of the solutions provide carbon calculation to Investor Portal, Supplier Portal, Greenstone Enterprise, and they all reference our global emissions factor library of over 1 million emissions factors. The resulting emissions are shared with the enterprise environment module for reporting, target setting and tracking, dedicated Scope 3 reporting, initiative savings, and so on. And so I just show you an example here of the Scope 3 category dashboard, showing the different types of emissions assigned to each category. So we can see across multiple categories and the breakdown of the emission sources for each one. And here we can see an example of the supplier or portfolio company, their data entry wizards that cover all of the emission sources and the immediate outputs available from those calculations. And lastly, please visit the website to access more resources around Scope 3 and many other topics there as well. We've got the blogs and we've got webinars there that are listed, which directly relate to what we've been through today. We've also just released a Scope 3 emissions reporting guide, and this is an introduction to the topic along with some guidance on where to start. That, I believe, will be distributed to all of the attendees of the webinar. So hopefully you'll receive that in due course. I'm sure you'll receive a recording as well. So I appreciate that's been a quick run through. Hopefully it provided a reasonable amount of background and some insight into how you can begin to better capture primary data from your suppliers to feed into what is obviously a very broad topic. But thank you for joining today. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it was useful.